Hello and welcome to Statistically Speaking Episode 2. This is a unique wrestling analysis podcast built around statistics of in-ring wrestling. For episode number 2 of Statistically Speaking, we are going to be looking at the G1 Climax 30 that just concluded last weekend. Joining me today, I have Dan. You will know him as @the Excellence of Procrastination on Twitter. Dan, how are you doing this morning?
Good, thank you.
Also joining us today for this episode of the podcast is Gareth from Rest Hold. Now, is it Rest Hold Radio or Rest Hold Wrestling, Gareth?
Rest Hold Wrestling.
Rest
Hold Enthusiasts. That's what we are.
Rest Hold Enthusiasts. So like Baron Corbin, Randy Orton enthusiasts.
Oh yeah, they're the best.
They're the best. Cool. Okay, so pictures in the bedroom, that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, Randy Orton all over my ceiling.
It'll certainly help you sleep, like.
I hear voices in my head.
Cool. So, Dan, how are you doing this morning? How are things? How are you feeling about talking about the G1?
Yeah, good. I was saying, looking through all the statistics and trying to sort of actually think back to some of the matches. It's always such a mammoth event, the G1, that trying to remember everything that happened is a bit tricky. But I did watch it in sort of 2 bursts as well, so actual life kept getting in the way, which is irritating. But no.
What do you mean 2 bursts?
So rather than watching them all on one night, immediately as they came out, I sort of watched the first few nights and then got busy, and so didn't watch the next lot for a while. So watched the last sort of 6 nights in the course of about 2 days, I think. So just 'cause I didn't want to get too far behind.
Did you hate it a little bit by the end of like 6 nights in a row?
When you're watching another Yujiro Takahashi match, at that point you think, do I really need to be watching this? But no, I do still love the G1, even though that's there's a lot of wrestling.
And Gareth, what are your kind of initial summative thoughts on the G1 as a whole?
It's kind of like the World Cup, isn't it? When you can't wait for it to come around, and then when you're just like, oh my god, that's just too much, and you can't get through it all. But then you just have to. I think the last 2 World Cups I've watched literally every game.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, just because I've had nothing to do, and the same with the last 2 G1s, just because, well, I've kind of forced myself to do so. But yeah, I mean, it's just kind of insane that it's even something that they do, really. But it's so good. But then, whilst you're trying to make your way through it, almost every day, and then you've got Evil versus, I don't know, whoever. But Evil versus anyone. It's just like, oh, do I have to watch this? But it's good fun in the end. It's all about the journey.
I've never watched a World Cup in its entirety before, actually. Like, certainly watched like loads of the games, but yeah, I've never really sat down to watch Senegal versus South Korea in a meaningless group game.
See, those are 2 of my favourite teams. So.
I was plucked those out of the air. Right, so what we shall do is we're going to start with the final, because we're as much as Gareth might want to in true World Cup watching fashion, we're not going to go through this match by match. Might completely lose the will to live, and I can't talk about Evil too much, or this will just become miserable. So very miserable. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about Kota Ibushi versus Sanada in the final. Did it kind of stand up to G1 finals of the past? What do the stats say? And then we're also going to kind of contrast how Kota Ibushi and Sanada wrestled that final with kind of how they wrestled the rest of the tournament. Did they up things for the final? Did they fall down because of tactics or whatever? So I'll walk you through the final. For Dan and Gareth, that is slide number 28. Yes, I've created more than 28 slides. I'm not a nerd. You are. So the final of the G1, Kota Ibushi versus Sanada. They won their blocks in very different fashion. Sanada lost his first 3 matches and then won 6 on the bounce, whereas Kota Ibushi won, lost, I believe it was, and then won 5 on the bounce. In the final, 53% of the offense went to Kota Ibushi, 47% to Sanada, as how maths works. Kota Ibushi with the strikes, 76 compared to Sanada's 47. More strike downs from Ibushi as well, 10-7. Grapples was pretty even, 5 from Ibushi, 6 from Sanada. Grapples refers to kind of like slamming moves, suplexes and the like. 2 dives apiece, 117 seconds of submissions. So that means like if Kota Ibushi did 5 submissions, the total that he held his opponent in those submissions is for 117 seconds. Sanada 183 seconds, reversals 33-32, pretty even, 7 pin attempts each, no fouls from either man. This is perhaps a little bit unusual in sort of G1 booking at the moment, as in there was 0 fouls in this match. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Kota Ibushi, confident, taunting, 12 taunts, and when Kota Ibushi kind of taunts, it's kind of firing up. 4 taunts from Sanada. 4 taunts from Sanada is probably quite a lot, as he's kind of, the cold skull, emotionless. It did take 2 finishers for Kota Ibushi to put Sanada away. Sanada did manage to get Kota Ibushi in the cold skull at 1 point during this match. Did any of these statistics stand out for you as being key to how the match went down as you remember it? I'll throw this to you, Gareth.
I'd say it's fairly in line with what I remember. I think something that did kind of surprise me is the submissions for Kota Ibushi, just because I always, throughout the G1, at least the matches that I go back to and I remember, it's just always striking, and obviously he did a lot of that as well. But yeah, I mean, the fact that he did quite a lot of that, Sanada you kind of expect that from him as one of his main moves, is that, I forget what it's called, but the submission he
the cold skull, I think. Is it not just called the cold skull? Yeah.
It's skull end, isn't it?
Oh,
skull
yeah. You're right. Skull end.
It's like a dragon sleeper type thing, isn't
exactly.
it? But yeah, so that's probably the one that would. Another thing, the time that New Japan gave was 1 second different from yours. So I wonder how who's right. Well, what a mystery. But
I'm right, because what happens is I stop the timer when the ref counts. So when he hits 3, I'm like, right, match is over, and then the bell tends to come a little bit after. And I think they maybe go exactly bell to bell, which, I don't know, it's probably semantics, but yeah, I would say that I'm probably right, but I'm probably wrong. I also got like that, they called it 18 seconds when Goto beat, what's his face, Yano, whereas I had 17 seconds. So I think I am counting like a second less for that reason. Just whilst I'm now talking, Kota Ibushi, his average submission time, throughout the G1, so he comes in usually about 59 seconds of submission per hour of wrestling. So that's probably, when you multiply that up, that's pretty on trend for this final. It's not too far out. However, in terms of when you're saying does that reflect Kota Ibushi, he has the 8th least amount of submissions in the entire G1. So he's, as you're saying, you wouldn't say that he's much of a submitter. And you're absolutely right. You're thinking strikes from Kota Ibushi. Kota Ibushi is using the 4th most kind of strikes per hour of wrestling, 205 strikes per hour of wrestling from Kota Ibushi compared. So yeah, you're absolutely right. In what you're saying there.
Yeah. Another thing that kind of struck me was that Sanada's strike down rate is actually higher than Kota Ibushi's, which I wouldn't have expected. Obviously, Kota Ibushi throws a lot, but then in this match at least, Sanada threw the bigger blow. Well, he obviously didn't because he lost. But on average, he threw the bigger blows, which was another interesting little thing, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. 15% of Sanada's strikes are strike downs, compared to 13% of Kota Ibushi's. I suppose obviously the thing there is Kota Ibushi's thrown more, but a bigger percentage of Sanada's are resulting in knockdowns. Dan, I'll come to you. Same kind of question. What stands out in this final of the G1 to you?
I think it's sort of quite standard for a sort of a face v face final. I think that's obviously when you have face v heel, and I think the stats show this elsewhere in the tournament. You tend to get one person who massively dominates, often the heel, and that's part of the storytelling. But obviously, when you've got face v face, it doesn't work that way. And obviously, that's how this match went. 7 pin attempts each is obviously very even. And yeah, I think that the strikes from Ibushi are higher, but as you said, I think it's because he does a lot of those sort of little slaps and kicks. He seems to be able to do about 10 strikes in 2 seconds at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that sort of explains a lot of that. But yeah, I keep looking at the Sanada 183 second submission. I've said this before on Twitter, but I find the Skull End one of the least effective finishers in New Japan. I can't remember him properly sort of submitting someone using that. And yeah, he uses it 2 or 3 times, I think, in most matches. But it's clearly not working for him in this situation either.
No. So Sanada, in terms of submissions, is the sixth highest in New Japan. So yeah, that is something he's going to the well with quite a lot. And when we're mentioning how even it is, when we're kind of looking at the match flow, so here I kind of totals of offense for kind of 5-minute chunks. We've spoken a bit about football. This idea kind of comes from when during a football match, it's like Manchester United had 60% of the possession in the first 15 minutes, but then only 40% in the next 15 minutes. So it kind of gives you an idea of how the kind of peaks and troughs of how in the match. Here it's quite even. Sanada had the most for 4 of the 5 minutes. Ibushi had the most for 5 of the 5 minutes. I've got that the wrong way around. It's Sanada for 5, Ibushi for 5, but for 4. But the difference being is that when Sanada dominates 5 minutes, he barely dominates it. He has a tiny bit more than Ibushi in terms of offense. And when Ibushi dominates it, there's a bit more of a gap. So what that's saying is this was a back and forth match, but when Ibushi was in control, he's getting in more offense. But perhaps going back to Dan, your point, perhaps it's just because he's using those strikes to get in, 10 in 2 seconds. Very even match. What is really interesting about these two competitors, and what we're going to move on to next, slide 13 for my guests in your PowerPoint. The way that New Japan booked these two wrestlers throughout was really, really interesting. They weren't hugely dominant in their matches. So Ibushi slightly dominated the final 6% more of the offense than Sanada. But when we look at the offense difference throughout the tournament for these two wrestlers, they were both kind of resilient winners. So what we're now looking at is the offense difference for all of their matches. So this is calculated by taking away how much offense the competitor took from how much offense they achieved. Again, goal difference. Think of it for people that know football. So as you can see here, Sanada got 2 offensive moves and 4 offensive moves than his opponents in 2 of his matches. The rest of the time, he was 9 less, 42 less, 52 less, 33 less, 5 less, 22 less, and then 12 less in the final moves than his opponent. Ibushi's not dissimilar. The only match where he had more offense than his opponent until the final was in his 3rd match, where he got 6 more offensive moves in than Ishii, and then 12 more than Sanada in the final. Ibushi had 9. Where am I going with this? I'm lost again. So 7 less, 46 less, 16 less, 29 less, 31 less, 3, and then 10 less on his way to the final. What are your thoughts about New Japan booking their 2 finalists in such a, I wouldn't call either of these 2 guys underdogs, but such a kind of resilience-based manner? Dan, how does that kind of sit for you now that you kind of see those numbers? Is that how you viewed these 2 going through the tournament? And is it does it kind of make sense for these two to have these statistics as the kind of, strongest two reaching the final, as you might expect?
Yeah, again, I think it obviously goes back to that sort of face dynamic, both of them sort of going through the same sort of journey on the way there. I think that, in terms of the commentary, and obviously I'm going on the English commentary that I listen to here, some of the time we didn't have the English commentary. I watched it before it got to there. But it felt like they were telling that story more for Ibushi than they were for Sanada, certainly. So I'm quite surprised, for example, to see those big numbers for Sanada in matches 4 and 5. The interesting thing about that is, of course, that he lost his first 3 matches. It was only when he started getting beaten up that he actually started winning.
Yeah.
Slightly bizarre approach. I definitely felt they were telling that story with Ibushi almost throughout. And it's this whole he wants to be God story that they're telling. It's obviously building him up as this heroic figure. And I suppose to be a heroic figure, you do need to take quite a lot of hits before you respond.
Yeah. Moving along in your PowerPoint again, slide number 5, same topic. Here what I've done is I've plotted kind of the wrestlers' offense difference. So offense difference against their win-loss record. So the x-axis on this graph is how many is their win-loss record. So we'll stay with Ibushi. Ibushi throughout the whole tournament won 6 more matches than he lost. However, as you can see, his average offense difference is sitting around minus 125-ish. So throughout the entire tournament, Kota Ibushi has taken 125 around about moves more that he's taken, that he's been hit with, than he gave out, which is a big number across those 10 matches that he competed in. Whereas other end of the scale, let's take Kenta. Kenta, with his +1 record, dished out almost 200 moves more than he took. Okay, so what this graph is doing is it's quite literally saying, is it a disadvantage or an advantage to hit your opponent with more moves than you take? And then we have a trend line there. You can see that kind of highlighter-esque trend line. That's almost suggesting that getting the most offense in your match doesn't matter. Gareth, I'm going to ask you, what on earth do you make of that?
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? It's kind of strange. Again, using a football analogy, it's like, you do see it often, but usually the team that wins will have more shots. But this is like, we see the opposite happening. Obviously, Kenta did have a fairly decent tournament, but then you've got Yoshihashi up there, and they're very much telling the story of him, kind of this being, I guess, the best he's ever done, and him really showing himself off. But then he still didn't get very many wins. I think he got like 1, something like that. And obviously the 2 finalists are 2 of the ones who took the most damage. So it's interesting. I think it's one of those like storytelling dynamics that you kind of get in wrestling. But then even like you think of like Evil's tournament is really strange, because having looked at like through the statistics, he's often low down in them, and I'm like, literally, what does this guy offer? Because, but like, because he's not like a dominating heel, he's not somebody. But then he ended up with like I think 12 points as well.
The
so
difficulty
again,
with Evil is he almost breaks the stats. I think Dan maybe brought this up in another conversation we had. The issue with Evil is he like dominates a match quite often, but he's not actually doing anything that's legal. So like I like if he low blows someone, I don't add that to his offense column because it's an illegal maneuver. But like maybe I should, but I really feel like I shouldn't. So like Evil I hate Evil. Evil ruins everything, even my statistics.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you take him out of that bit, the only 2 people on that part of the chart are the 2 finalists, which would be a perfect story. So yeah, Evil is definitely ruining it for all of us.
But I really like this chart. So if you take the guys that have the positive in both columns, so like Kenta, Zack Sabre Jr., Naito, Jay White, Ospreay, and Okada, these guys are winning and they're getting the most offense in their matches. Then we've got the guys under them, Sanada, Evil, and Ibushi, who are winning, but are like having to do it from underneath. And then when we go to the other side, we've got the guys that are probably quite frustrated, Tanahashi, Shingo, Suzuki, Yoshihashi, and Yujiro, who are dominating their matches but are losing. So these are the guys that are like, they need to change something because they're in control, but they're screwing it up. And then we've got the guys underneath them, Yano, Goto, Cobb, Ishii, Taichi, Juice Robinson. These are the guys that are like hanging out in the trainer's room. They're injured, they're losing, they're sad. They've lost more than they've won. They've got beaten up whilst doing it. Nothing's going very well. Dan, is there anyone on whose position you're surprised at? Somebody who's losing, perhaps, that you thought you're surprised that they're dominating the match? Somebody that's winning and you're surprised that they're, who do you think you're surprised they're in the quadrant that they're in?
I think what stands out is Yoshihashi. That's such a high offense from him. And I know they were telling the story of him having a stronger tournament than normally. If the great Yoshihashi redemption story continues, despite him having lost 5 more matches than he won. But yeah, I mean, that's the fact that he seems to have a higher offense record than someone like Suzuki is amazing, really, when you think about some of the matches Suzuki was involved in. Taichi, I'm quite surprised he's down there. Again, that probably comes under your point of fouls. Not being counted, because I suspect that he dominates a lot of his matches. And I think it was only that one match with Ibushi where he didn't foul his way all the way through in that sort of that kick fest, which I'd like to see the stats on that one, actually. But yeah, I mean, that Yoshihashi statistic is really interesting, and you've already mentioned Kenta up there, who's obviously, at least he did get more wins, but it's a huge offense difference there for him. And I suppose he now has to sort of actually try and make use of that and pick up more of those wins with all the opportunities he's about to get.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said something really interesting there about Yoshihashi, more offense than Suzuki. I think what happened there is Yoshihashi tends to dominate his matches more than Suzuki, which seems like a weird sentence in itself. Suzuki tends to get more offense in his matches. He just must be taking more as well. If you go on to your next slide number 6, here's the same thing. It's win-loss record versus rate of offense. So this is, in an hour of wrestling, how much offense on average does a wrestler get. So Suzuki's right up there at the top. If Suzuki was to wrestle for an hour, he'd get almost 350 offensive moves in. Yoshihashi there almost 250. So they're both towards the kind of top end of the scale there. It's just for Yoshihashi to be getting a kind of better offense difference than Suzuki. Suzuki must be taking more than Yoshihashi. Your next slide underneath that does show, slide number 7, win-loss record versus rate of damage. This is how much wrestlers taking they're being hit with in an hour. Suzuki's around 280 there, hits he'd taken in an hour of wrestling. Yoshihashi's about 180. So what that's saying there is that Suzuki's matches are more, there's more offense going between the two wrestlers. But yeah, again, interestingly enough, on slide 6 there, the win-loss record versus rate of offense, again, it's a very, very negative correlation there, saying that like it doesn't matter a tremendous amount whether or not you're getting more offense in than your opponent. Whereas when we look at the rate of damage one right underneath there, we can see Ibushi right out in that kind of strong correlation, the right hand side, 6 wins, but he's taken over 250 shots kind of per hour. Like, is that, what do you make of that, Gareth? What do you make of like New Japan not attaching match victories to actually having to do damage to your opponent?
It is a weird one. Like, there's this whole annoying conversation online, which seems like it will never end, about like sports based and stuff. And this is one of the things that why like you can never really expect wrestling to be too sports based, because ultimately it's a storytelling medium. And I think this is where this comes into it, because the perception you have, like, just from watching without looking at the stats, I would have said Ibushi was fairly dominant. Suzuki was, even though he lost, and that Suzuki one shown in the stats. And then Sanada, throughout the tournament, I was shocked when, like, it came to the final weekend and he was up there within a chance, and even more shocked when he got to the final, because throughout the tournament, kind of as the stats show, he was kind of just plodding along. You know, you've got this core group of, like, guys like Tanahashi, Cobb, Goto, Itachi, and Robinson, who always seem to be quite close to each other in these ones as well. And then the same for White, Okada, Ospreay, and Naito. They're always in the same kind of bracket. So there's clearly differences between... There are some trends, but then there's some, like Ibushi and Sanada, who got to the final, kind of break that. And then guys like Yoshihashi and Suzuki, who also kind of break it. So there's some who are kind of sticking to what you kind of would expect. And then there's some who are just completely breaking the system. And then obviously, we've already spoken about Evil, but like, you just completely break it.
So that's it. I mean, it is an interesting thing. I mean, I don't think I'm suggesting that wrestlers should just get into the ring and let their opponent hit them until they're really tired out and then pin them. I don't think it's going that far, but it's just, it is interesting that there isn't, you know, one would expect there to be a correlation between win-loss records and the amount of offense that somebody can get in. It just doesn't really seem to be the thing.
Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say it shows how much focus I think that New Japan put on that final stretch in every match. You often get these amazing, and again it happened in the final. You get these amazing bursts where it feels like that's where the match is won and lost, and almost everything before that is sort of goes out the window a lot of the time. And I suppose that accounts for some of this, that you can be absolutely dominant for the whole match, but it's in that final 5 minutes when you're trading blows left, right, and centre, trading finishes, that's what results in the actual outcome. I'd be interested to see if this is the same against other G1s, because I think, for example, someone like Okada, he is always very good at telling an entire story across the match. I don't think he would be happy to see a stat like that where it's who is dominant isn't the one who's going to win. He's very much a long-term match storyteller. So, I'm not asking you to do this for the entire of the 129, Craig, but it would be interesting to see.
Going off that point that Dan made about Okada, I guess, like, again, using the football analogies, a team like Burnley can kind of like soak up a lot of pressure, and then, you know, they've got their tactics in order to score, and they can be fairly solid. I guess in wrestling you can kind of look into it, like Ibushi can kind of take a lot of damage and he can give a fair amount as well, and he can still get those wins. You can kind of read into it somewhat that way. Obviously Suzuki is someone who dishes out loads of damage, but he just kind of has no defense, and he just kind of allows himself to get hit because he can take it. Sometimes he can, sometimes he can't. So I guess there are, like, you in some of them you can pick out, like, the characters and how it matches up with their characteristics. Again, there are some which are probably they're just there. Obviously, the story with Yoshihashi, as we've spoken about, is another example of that, at least within this G1 for his character. So there's a little bit of that as well. I think you could, if you really looked into it, you could really break it down and apply some of that logic. Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. When I've done this before with AEW, what was really, really interesting there was that Lance Archer, his, like, offense difference would always be really negative. He always took more strikes than he dished out when he first joined AEW, which makes no sense because he dominates his entire match, kind of. Because what actually happens is he just lets opponents hit him, and then he laughs in their face, and then with one wallop he takes them down. So, for example, in his match against Marco Stunt technically had so much more of the match offense because he hit Lance Archer so many more times than Archer hit him. The difference there being was the 13 shots that Marco Stunt would hit Archer with had, like, no difference, and then Archer was, like, picking him up and throwing him to the moon. Which, it might be interesting. On slide number 4 there is your offense difference just quite pure numbers? I don't know. I'm going to put you on the spot here, Gareth. Is there a wrestler there that you could look at? You could take their offense, say, like, what was the story? Why was it so positive, or why was it so negative? Does anyone jump out at you immediately?
Kenta dominates that graph there, and he had a decent tournament, but he did lose a lot of matches as well. And thinking back, I can't really remember what his real story was, apart from, like, I'm in Bullet Club, and then that whole kind of wider story of Bullet Club.
Romance. He was distracted. He had that cameraman romance.
That's a high moment during the G1.
Yeah, it really was.
But yeah, I mean, that's one that I could kind of think and not really think of a reason to explain it, I guess. I'm not sure there's really anyone else really stands out. But yeah, Kenta, like, especially with the fact that he wasn't just up there, he was like number one in that graph.
Yeah.
Kind of a weird one. Kind of plays into his style, just the way he wrestles. But then again, it's not like when he does lose, it's like he's not a bigger guy than a Glance Archer, so he's just getting all the hits in or whatever. But yeah, that's one I couldn't really explain.
Could you say with Kenta, because of his injury history, it's more important for him to be getting the offense in? Because if he doesn't, then he's in more of a precarious position. He's like more likely to get hurt and lose. Whereas somebody like Kota Ibushi, who looks like he's made out of like diamond or something, can afford to get hit and will be able to come back.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. And also thinking back to the last G1 where he was disappointed, and that kind of triggered his heel turn as well. It might just be a thing of he's just trying to be a dominant heel, and that's kind of the tactics. Yeah. Thinking in kayfabe, obviously, that's kind of the tactics he's gone into the tournament with. So it could just be something as simple as that, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, so next, we've kind of been talking about how the statistics reveal the stories there are like their wrestlers' fighting styles. If you head down to the bottom of your podcast, slide number 29, this is a really cool thing that Brandon Thurston of WrestleNomics put together. I kind of put out a tweet asking if anybody who was better at Excel than me could do something fancy with the numbers. What Brandon did was he kind of created an index of like how much wrestlers use specific kinds of moves compared to everybody else, and it's kind of like a weighted system. So there, like, you can see that Minoru Suzuki is the most prominent striker. That won't come as a major surprise. Jay White, most prominent grappler, as the person that kind of writes us down the numbers all the time. Jay White uses loads of grapples. Number 2 there is Jeff Cobb, not surprising. Biggest high flyer, Will Ospreay. Again, this isn't kind of drawing out huge surprises, but it's a cool thing. A lot of kind of fighting games or whatever, when you were younger, when you're building a character, you choose a style. The WWE games, you now choose styles with your wrestler. So I thought this was a really cool thing to do. So guys that relate, so your flyers there, the only one in the whole G1 that could be called a flyer was Will Ospreay. Guys relying mostly on grapples, Jay White, Juice Robinson, Yujiro Takahashi, Hiroshi Tanahashi, Tetsuya Naito, Jeff Cobb, and Hiroki Goto. Guys that are more strike-based, we've got Minoru Suzuki, Kenta, Ishii, Shingo, Ibushi. Then technical guys, so this is guys that are reversing and using submissions. We've got Kazuchika Okada, and that's perhaps interesting. I don't know if last year he would have ended up in technical. I think it might have been more grappling for him. ZSJ, Zack Sabre Jr., no surprises. Yoshihashi does the longest submissions. If you're sitting with the stopwatch in front of you, that butterfly lock thing he does often goes for like 100 seconds. It's quite long.
Wow.
Sanada, not surprising. Lots of skull ends. Unorthodox guys, these are guys that are fouling and taunting quite a lot. Toru Yano, I mean, Evil and Taichi. So, yeah, Dan, I'll throw this to you. Is there, I mean, I've already kind of spoken a bit about Okada there. Does anything stand out as noteworthy in terms of how these guys have been categorized?
Well, I was just going to say that Gareth clearly needs to get posters of Yoshihashi on his ceiling if he's that good at those rest holds.
Absolutely, yeah.
But no, I mean, a lot of them seem to fit in exactly where you'd expect them to fit in, I think. Which I suppose is actually a good thing. It shows that they are telling those stories and those performers are consistent in the way that they're performing, and even in the G1.
Statistics are not a waste of time.
Indeed, exactly. So it's not just the percentage
Reddit
of it.
trolls can keep your horrible words to yourself.
I was actually looking at the number of strikers, the top strikers as well. It looks like being in Block A was absolutely no fun whatsoever.
Yeah.
I think the top 6.
We'll come on to that, but yeah.
So top 6 of those were all in the A block, so definitely not one you wanted to be in. But no, just in terms of the characteristics, absolutely, it is interesting to see that the stats do sort of back up the perception of the characters that you get just from watching it without that statistical analysis.
Gareth, what do you, as the kind of storytelling person, what do you think of
that? Okada's definitely kind of one that really jumps out. Obviously, he's got 50 on his striking and grappling as well, so he's kind of across the board. Nothing's really dominating, but technical is the one, and I guess that's him getting over that new submission, which was the story, if you want to call it that. I'm very unsure what that story. That's a larger conversation. But yeah, another one obviously is Will Ospreay because he's beefed up a bit, and I was wondering how much he would stick to his old style, but he definitely still had those spots. It's not quite as to the level of his matches with Ricochet, obviously, because his opponents aren't doing that. But that was another one which kind of again, you can see his striking rate and his grappling rate are kind of in the middle of the pack as well.
His striking rate there is the highest out of anyone that's not in the striking category.
Yeah, there you go. So he's kind of in the striking, he's kind of upper middle, and then in the grappling, he's bang in the middle there.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see. I think especially with his heel turn, it'll be very interesting to see what his numbers are like moving forward, especially with that flying. I kind of hope he stays with this kind of cocky persona, and then therefore that kind of flying, exciting style remains. But I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, brilliant. So, Dan, going back to what you were saying about blocks, if we go to top strikers in the G1, so that's slide number 16, this is just a very simple chart. So a lot of what I do with this comes from my interest in football, and I play Football Manager. You can see which one of your players does the most dribbles per match, the best shooter, that kind of thing. This is essentially that for wrestling. And what we have here is how many strikes each wrestler would, on average, manage to use if they wrestled for an hour. Dan, you said that Block A looks like no fun, so I colour-coded this in their blocks. The darker blue is Block A, the lighter blue is Block B. As you can see, Kenta is 5th in this, but he is the only B block member in the top 9. The rest of them are all from A block, with Yoshihashi number 10, Naito number 11, and then 12, 13 being from A block again, and then all of the bottom 7 are from B block. So that really does kind of back up what you just said there, Dan, that A block looked like no fun. I would imagine the B block guys head out for a nice meal after the match, and the A block guys stick around to ice their selves. Yes, everything. So I'll quickly run through this. We've got Minoru Suzuki on top, 262 strikes per hour, followed by Shingo Takagi, Tomohiro Ishii, Kota Ibushi being the top 4, no surprises there. Kenta, number 5, and then Will Ospreay, 6th best striker in the G1 at number 6, followed by Yujiro Takahashi, interestingly enough, Jay White, Taichi, Taichi's quite low there, actually. That's interesting. Yoshihashi, Tetsuya Naito, Kazuchika Okada, Jeff Cobb, Hiroki Goto, perhaps quite low. Juice Robinson, Tanahashi, very low. Zack Sabre Jr., Sanada, Evil, Toru Yano at the bottom. Any of these kind of stick out for you, Dan?
Well, I think Ospreay being so high up on the strikes is quite unusual and feeds into what Gareth was just saying about whilst he's still technically a flyer, he's obviously changing his style and making those strikes a big part of his game. I don't know what Yujiro Takashi's doing with those strikes, but it's clearly not working.
Not much.
But I'm just going back to the fact, the A block versus B block. I think it's a similar story to what last year, actually. I can't remember which way around it was, but there was the group that Moxley was in last year was a similar sort of thing. That was the heavy hitting group, and then the other group was the technical, and it looks like they've done a similar thing here. So people like Tanahashi and Zack Sabre Jr. still quite low on those strikes, but their match in particular between the two of them, I don't think would have had many strikes at all. That was sort of all mat based wrestling, effectively.
It was kind of, I can remember noticing that one as I was doing it. It was kind of reversal, 10 seconds of submission, reversal, 10 seconds of submission, and so forth.
Exactly, yeah. But Goto is low. You're right. That is a slightly bizarre one, because you imagine that he's normally involved in sort of these sort of face-offs. But again, maybe that's more due to the people he was facing rather than his own change of offense. Yeah,
Yoshihashi outstriking Hiroki Goto.
Yep.
Who'd have thunk it? Gareth, pick an in-ring statistic, grappling, diving, whatever. What are you interested in?
Let's go for the submission.
Submissions, okie dokie.
I can't pronounce that word. To striking.
Yeah, so top submission wrestlers in the G1. So this is for if a match went an hour, how much of that hour of wrestling would be this wrestler holding a submission, and this is in seconds. So if Zack Sabre Jr. wrestled for a whole hour, he would have his opponent in a submission hold for 567 seconds, which is, what's that, around like 7 minutes? No, 6 minutes, about 6 minutes. I would have thought it'd be more. Then we've got Yoshihashi coming in second. Minoru Suzuki is number 3. Okada 4th. Tanahashi, which is interesting. Then Sanada, then Kenta, Tetsuya Naito, Evil, Jay White, Hiroki Goto, Juice Robinson, which is quite interesting. Ibushi not really going for the submissions. Neither was Cobb, Shingo, Takahashi, Ishii, Taichi, Will Ospreay. And then if Toru Yano was in an hour of wrestling, I don't really think I would be able to withstand that, but if Toru Yano was in a wrestling match for a whole hour, he would do 6 seconds of submission. So, Gareth, what stands out there for you as interesting or noteworthy?
It's interesting to see Sanada's fairly high, but he's not like right up there, which is one that I would have kind of expected. Obviously, you've got your obvious ones in Zack Sabre Jr., and having watched it, Yoshihashi is obviously very, very high when you watch the matches. I probably wouldn't have said that. I think it's all fairly like what you would expect, really. Okada, again, it seemed like he was trying to lock on that submission all the time, but I think it goes to show how much Zack Sabre Jr. and Yoshihashi were doing submissions, the fact that he's not right up there as well, because he's one I would have expected in the top 2 or something, just because it's a move that kind of sticks in your mind, that he was constantly going to, but he's still up there as you would expect. But yeah, I mean, it's all, again, the B block, as we said, the striking was very much dominated by the A block. B block is very much dominating here again, and I guess it is what you expect, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got Okada and Suzuki. I'm surprised Suzuki's up there. But yeah, we've got Okada and Suzuki in positions 3 and 4. But yeah, it's the rest of the top 10, except for one, is all B block. We've got Jay White in 10th, but 7 of the top 9 are from B block, and 7 of the bottom 8 are from A block. and then with Toru Yano with his 6 seconds right there at the bottom. And Dan, what would pick a category? What shall we go to next?
Well, I know you like to talk about fouls, Greg. So
good.
Look at the rule breakers and see if that worked for them or not.
Cool. Okie dokie. So, top rule breaker. If Toru Yano wrestled for an hour, he would break the rules 54 and a half times. Evil, hot on his tail, with 53 times. Then we've got Jay White, 41. Taichi, Minoru Suzuki. Now Yujiro Takahashi. Then Kenta, we've got a bit of a drop-off now. So, like, Kenta would be breaking the rules 22 times. Tetsuya Naito 11 times. Zack Sabre Jr., Takagi around 8 times. Juice Robinson, we're dropping down to only 5 times in an hour of wrestling. Ishii, Tanahashi, Yoshihashi. Will Ospreay, only 2.5 times per hour. Interesting. Okada, Sanada, Jeff Cobb. Kota Ibushi would only break the rule half a time in an hour of wrestling. Same with Hiroki Goto. So yeah, it's a little bit more split in terms of blocks. The worst rule breakers, 1 and 2 are in B block. 3, 4, 5 and 6 are in A block. 7, 8 and 9 are in B block, and then number 10 is in A block. So it's 50-50 in terms of rule breakers, but the two worst offenders by some margin, Toru Yano and Evil. I'm going to do some quick, I don't know if I could, how long would Kota Ibushi have to wrestle to break the rules as much as Yano? I think it's like 100 hours, something like that. So yeah, let's go on then, Dan. Who fits in there from your impressions of the G1, and who breaks what you would have expected?
Well, I mean, those top 2 are obviously expected based on how they've gone, but you sort of, on a sort of a more, Yano is a joker. That's sort of his rule breaking is comedy. That's part of his act. The fact that
sorry, I'll interrupt as well. His matches are quite short also, so it's more forgivable.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing. Like we've sort of joked about Evil ruining the stats, but I mean,
it's not a joke.
How tedious his matches have become.
Yes,
there are
tedious is the word.
Because then again, the next 2. Jay White and Taichi, again, you expect those to be relatively high, but the way they do it is a bit more nuanced than Evil. And I mean, the one that's very low there is Will Ospreay, because they obviously didn't tell his sort of heel story until the last match. You'd imagine that number will start to creep up a bit now, but well, depending on whether he joins another stable, sets up his own, I'm not quite sure what the next step is there for him. But absolutely, I expect that one to go quite high. I always find it interesting when you look at these to actually see, 3.6 from someone like Tanahashi. You just can't imagine him ever doing anything nasty, but he does an edge.
He gives it back a bit, I think, Tanahashi. Like, he'll kind of, if somebody does something to him, he'll give it back a bit, I think, is perhaps where his comes from.
Yeah, and I think that's the same for Naito, actually, as well. I mean, obviously, Naito will, depending on his opponent, get involved in some shenanigans, but I think most of that, as you said, is in retaliation.
Yeah, I think from memory he wrestles that depends on his opponent. If he's wrestling a heel, he just comes in and will just break the rules because he's like, well, they're going to do it to me. But I don't believe he wrestles the same way against babyface wrestlers. So, like, I mean, one could argue like Tetsuya Naito is just like not being an idiot. He's just not letting people take advantage.
And the other thing there is 4 of those top 7 are all Bullet Club.
Yeah.
Yes. So you feel, and obviously that's a story they're telling, the sort of combustible faction there. But basically they've got a whole load of treats, and it's going to bite some of them at some point.
So what's really interesting there is you Dan, you spoke briefly about Will Ospreay. If we go on, I've called it top showman. I don't really know what to label the graph, but if we look at the taunt rates, so this is like how many taunts, and this is a bit subjective. This is just me sitting and being like, oh, he's kind of if I was playing SmackDown versus Raw, I would have done that's a taunt button. This is maybe the one that's most open to criticism. But Will Ospreay is fourth in terms of taunts, and I would suggest that Will Ospreay's heel turn story has been more kind of presented by that kind of cocky taunting side, the way that he's rubbed his opponent's faces in it, rather than kind of actual real rule breaking. Gareth, does anyone in this chart jump out at you? Sorry, I'll run through it very quickly for the listener. So we've got Jay White, 45 taunts per hour, Toru Yano, Juice Robinson, Will Ospreay, Minoru Suzuki. A lot of that is him like taunting his opponent, like come on, kind of stuff. The same is true for the next few guys: Ishii, Ibushi, Takagi, Taichi. These are all guys that are like challenging their opponents for a strike battle. Kenta, Hiroshi Tanahashi, Evil, Yujiro Takahashi. Why he's taunting, I do not know. Yoshihashi, Jeff Cobb, Tetsuya Naito, all the way down 14 taunts per hour. It's quite low. Okada, I think, would have taunted more in the past if not for this story he's doing. Zack Sabre Jr., Goto, 19th out of 20 for taunting, probably not surprising. The guy with the least kind of interaction with his opponents and or the fans, G1 finalist, Sanada. Good, that's interesting. So yeah, Gareth, what make you of this?
Yeah, it is an interesting list. As you said with Ospreay, there was a moment where he was like, literally he was just in such a. Can we swear on this?
You may. I try not to in case any impressionable youngsters ever get hold of this, which I'm hoping that'll never happen. I've kind of insulated those two parts of my life, but yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I was trying to find a way of saying it without like saying it, but yeah, he was just someone, I can't remember who it was against, but he's just like, "You're a little bitch, mate. You're a little bitch," and I was just like, as soon as that came, I was like, you've got to be turning heel. Either that, or you know that a lot of people don't like you at the moment, and you just don't care anymore. But yeah, so that was definitely one. So not super surprised to see him up there, even though maybe in the past you would have been. Sanada is one because he often like plays to the fans or whatever. Maybe it's because they can't chant now that he's just not doing it. But like he was always someone at the start of the match would like stand on the ropes and get them all going and stuff, and But I mean, in this G1, he was pretty much just like fixing his hair, and that's like the extent to which like he didn't do a lot of that. Yeah, so again, it was because if he'd been doing more of that, it would have been like, okay, they still see him as like a crowd favourite, but he wasn't. So when he got to the final, it was a really big shock for that. And of course, another one to talk about is Jay White because his taunting was just hilarious.
Yes.
The crowd, but he's just so good at that.
I think you cut out there a bit, Gareth. His taunting's hilarious.
Yeah, he's just the best, is basically what I said.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll maybe quickly blitz through these so we don't spend too much time on it. I'll do top threes. Top three grapplers were Jay White, Jeff Cobb, and Yujiro Takahashi somehow. Top three strike downers, heaviest strikers. Tomohiro Ishii, Jeff Cobb, interestingly, Suzuki, Ibushi, Takagi, Will Ospreay, maybe trying to get over his kind of new physique in hitting guys to the ground. Top flying wrestlers, dive rates, kind of specialists, Will Ospreay with 14 per hour. Next best is Kenta with 6.5. Only 8 wrestlers with more than one dive per hour. So New Japan really isn't land of the high flyers. Counter wrestlers, guys that are using a lot of counters per hour. Will Ospreay, almost 100 per hour. Zack Sabre Jr., to nobody's surprise. Takagi, Okada, Goto. It's about the only thing he's quite high at. Poor Goto. What else have we got? Oh, so this is quite a good one. So slide number 24. This is just top offensive wrestlers in the G1s, and offensive not in kind of like swearing and stuff, but kind of total offense. So we've got Minoru Suzuki, 340 offensive moves per hour. Quite a bit ahead of his competition, Shingo Takagi with 270, Ishii 260. Then we've got Yoshihashi at number 4, Kenta Ibushi, Jay White, Okada, Ospreay, ZSJ, Zack Sabre Jr., Tetsuya Naito, Yujiro Takahashi needs to learn how to do something with all that offense. Tanahashi, Jeff Cobb, Goto, Taichi, Juice Robinson, and third from bottom is G1 finalist Sanada. Second from bottom is Evil, and Toru Yano with 30 moves per hour. Anything interesting here, Dan?
The more we go through these stats, I can't understand how Sanada got to the final. Obviously, like the top two there, Suzuki and Takagi, we've seen them go against each other a fair amount in the last few months, and will do again after the results. But Suzuki's offense rate is just staggering. Actually, going back to when we were looking at the submissions earlier, I didn't understand how he had time to do any submission moves, to be honest, because he spends so much time hitting people. But yeah, the standout one there, the surprise one, is Yoshihashi in fourth. It's just, again, his stats seem to be incredibly high across the board. Yeah. And it will be interesting to see if they actually follow through on this and try and build him to actually get some wins along with that, or whether this is just sort of a little bit of goodwill off the back of the.
Did he not get pinned in the first show after the G1 to set up a 6-man title match?
Probably. I haven't seen that one. So
normal services.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is the other end of the scale. Most resilient wrestlers in the G1. So this is the wrestlers that took. This is how much offense a wrestler would kind of be hit with during an hour of wrestling. Tomohiro Ishii, Stone Pitbull himself, 289 moves per hour he'd be hit with. Suzuki, not even bothering to protect himself a lot of the time, in second. Kota Ibushi, third. A big part of his story is kind of absorbing offense and then coming back. Shingo Takagi, Jeff Cobb, a little surprised at him. Hiroki Goto at number 6. Okada, Sanada at number kind of 9 there. Tanahashi, Ospreay, Taichi, Yoshihashi, Jay White, Evil, Juice Robinson, Kenta, Naito, Zack Sabre Jr., Yujiro Takahashi, and Toru Yano. Gareth, anything quickly there that jumps out?
Yeah, we've kind of spoken about Sanada quite a lot, and in how he got to the final, and he is up there, but like, you very much see them telling that story of Ibushi being resilient, and again, as we said earlier, it didn't seem like they were really telling that story with Sanada. Like, in the early rounds when he was losing, I remember the commentary were often like, what's Sanada going to do? Because, he doesn't look like he's going to win. And I guess they're laying on a bit thick. But like, at least in ring, they weren't really telling that story of him being super resilient, at least. He's obviously up there in the top half, but, towards the bottom half of that. Mm-hmm. So that's a bit of a strange one. I think besides that, not really massively surprising. No. Again, guys like Ishii and Suzuki are exactly who you expect up there. Ibushi as well. Obviously, we spoke about that story. So yeah, I think Sanada's the main real surprise, given that he kind of got to the final. I struggled to see what like his real story was. Yeah. He kind of just seemed to go in there, get hit, do a few hits back, win after the first 3, which he lost, I think. And yeah, it was kind of just like he was just there.
Well, and I'm gonna skip a slide to kind of focus on that point. So slide number 27, I've called it most ferocious in the G1. I don't know if that's a good title. I'm also going to change the colours on this because my grayscale thing that I've gone for here looks terrible. Anyway, this is the kind of average amount of moves total that occurred in each guy's match. So I've just added how much offense they took and how much offense they gave out in their matches, and then kind of come to an average per hour. So in a Minoru Suzuki match, if it went an hour, him and his opponent would typically use 622 moves. So that's quite a lot. So it's kind of like who's matches are the kind of most statistically bountiful, like which matches have the most things happening. So we're going to come to Sanada. You're going to have to wait a wee while because I'm going to start at the top of this list. So we've got Suzuki, Ishii, Takagi, Ibushi. And those are the four that are kind of quite far ahead of everybody else. All A-block wrestlers again. So those four are kind of strike-laden matches, strike-heavy matches, a lot of things going on. Then we've got Yoshi-Hashi in 5th place. Very interesting. Jeff Cobb, another interesting one. And then Hiroki Goto, followed by Okada, Kenta, Jay White, Will Ospreay, Tanahashi. So these guys are kind of middle of the road. Their matches are kind of average for what's going on. Tanahashi, Naito, Zack Sabre Jr., Yujiro Takahashi, as we get to the kind of slower matches. Taichi, Sanada, 4th from bottom. Again, G1 finalist Sanada. His matches had the 4th least things happening in them. Juice Robinson, our good pal Evil, and right there at the bottom, as has been the case, Toru Yano. So I don't know, Gareth, if you want to take that one, how does that's kind of statistical backup for what you were saying about Sanada, I would venture.
Yeah, I guess you could say that, like, looking at that, it kind of contextualizes it as well, and that not a lot happens because he's the cold skull, and I guess that goes in with his character. It's all more calculated and stuff like that. So I guess if you were to sit down and watch the matches, it would maybe make a bit more sense than the stats on the paper. And obviously, in anything, stats only tell a certain amount of the story, don't they? But even so, it is a bit odd, like that he is often kind of lower down, but has a fairly dominant performance in getting to the final in terms of wins and losses and stuff. But I think that does kind of contextualize it. Again, being in B block, you see the bottom half of that graph is more dominated by B block, whereas A block, a lot of the guys who are going to do those heavy hitting matches are in there anyway. So that's another part of it as well, being in the block. If he'd been in the other one, he'd probably be at least middle of the road. Like if you switched him and Ibushi, he'd probably be more middle of the road, maybe upper half of these graphs. But yeah, I think that's a good amount of context.
That's fair and valid. I was getting a bit carried away of just trying to slag off Sanada, but that's certainly a bit more fair. And going back to the blocks again, there's only 3 B block guys in the top 10 for guys that are putting on the fast-paced matches. So again, it does seem like B block was maybe nicer to be part of, not as ambitious, but less hurty, to kind of be simplistic. And the last thing that we're going to look at today is the average match offense in the G1. So this is at the end of each match, you can say like, so for the final we had Ibushi got 53% offense, whereas Sanada got 47%. So when you kind of get an average for all of their matches across the whole G1, so this kind of tells you who is kind of dominant in their matches and who isn't. So let's start at the bottom this time. We've got Toru Yano, 17% of offense in his matches. It also doesn't help that most of his offense is fouls, which I don't really count. Jeff Cobb, 41%. Sanada, only 42% on average. That kind of resilient, popping up with the win at the end type thing. Evil, 43%. Kota Ibushi, 5th lowest average match percentage, 45%. Taichi and Ishii, both on 46. Hiroki Goto, on average, got 50% of the offense in his matches. 51% Shingo, 52% Okada, Ospreay and Tanahashi. 53% for Jay White and Juice Robinson. 55% of offense on average in his matches for Minoru Suzuki. 5th most was Tetsuya Naito with 59% of offense on average. Yoshi-Hashi on average had 60%. Yujiro Takahashi on average had 60%. Zack Sabre Jr. on average had 62%. And Kenta coming in at most dominant per offense with 63% of match offense. Dan, similar kind of question as I've been posing throughout. Anything interesting? Anything jumping out?
Just looking at the one person we haven't really mentioned across the whole of this chat is Tetsuya Naito, who obviously was very much in the running until the last day, but obviously it seems to have been fairly middle of a lot of these charts, but he is very high there on the match offense. And I think that is something that they were trying to tell throughout, that he was more dominant in this tournament. He's the double champion. He should be more dominant.
Absolutely.
And they were tense. So I think that bears that out, certainly. The Kenta and Zack Sabre Jr. are interesting, because again, neither of them really looked like they were ever going to win the tournament or to do that. So it's interesting that they were giving them that much offense. I suppose Kenta obviously was being built up to ultimately take it all away from Naito, so maybe that's part of that story. But it'd be interesting to see what they do with both of them, because those statistics certainly suggest that they want them to be seen as more dominant. Although then maybe hopefully they don't think that about Yujiro Takahashi, because otherwise it's going to be a long few months.
Yeah, I don't know. It does come back to the point I was making at the beginning about it is interesting how strongly New Japan have put that kind of the winner doesn't get the offense and the loser does. Because, I mean, we've got Yoshihashi and Yujiro Takahashi up there, who between them lost, I think, 15 of their 18 matches. Gareth, same thing. How does this chart reflect the G1 for you?
Yeah, I think we've spoken about Sanada and Ibushi a lot towards the start, and you see again in this graph that those points we were speaking about earlier are the same again here. Going to Dan's point about Naito and being that dominant champion, because it is a point we haven't really touched upon. I think that's a very good point. They did a really good job of making Naito look like a dominant champion, even though obviously he took a few losses. You'd hope the champion would. He looked strong and in control of all of his matches, even if he ended up losing. And like you say, Kenta being that most dominant one in that final match against Naito definitely kind of at least sells that story, even if throughout the tournament you didn't really get that sense from Kenta. I think a lot of it is guys just in the middle, but those two, like Yoshihashi and Yujiro, you saw them they're very much going for, particularly Yoshihashi, that kind of idea of, these guys are overachieving, but when you look at it there, they're really overachieving. I thought they were kind of just hanging with the bunch when I was watching, but they're actually right up there. So that's a really, really strange one. I guess again, I think someone like as well, but again, he takes so much as well that when it comes, you see him do so much. But he just gets hit constantly. Suzuki in a similar vein, but he's obviously got the positive on the positive side of it. So it's very interesting for sure. But I can't get over Yoshihashi and Yujiro right up there near the top. Yeah,
I do. I get very kind of taken by the idea of it is very similar. I did stats on old Okada matches a while back, and he was winning matches, but he's losing out in terms of offense. John Moxley for ages in AEW was losing out so much offense, but winning all the time. And it's really interesting how many wrestling companies are using that kind of trope of the winner doesn't actually, dominate the match. And I don't know if the question is, well, you're kind of overcomplicating things with that, or is that too easy a trope? If you have these statistics on the screen, could you tell more stories? I don't know. Right, we're going to finish off here. Dan, if you could book one thing on the way to the Dome, what would you do?
They have to separate those two belts. They're going 2 nights again at the Dome, which I think is excellent. I think that's a good idea. But I think they obviously can't tell the same story that they did this year with the 4 people going for both belts, and that they need to find a way to split those belts for me. I think that's really hamstrung them since they did it, despite great moment as it was. I think they need to find a way to do that, and obviously there's a couple of options there now with Kenta and Evil. having picked up those wins over Naito and Sanada, of course. And actually, maybe that is where the Sanada story goes at this point, is more towards that Intercontinental belt. But it's a very hard thing to do, because in losing, you're making your IWGP champ lose as well. But no, that would be my main thing. I'd be very disappointed, I think, if we got to Wrestle Kingdom and both belts were still on the same person.
Yeah, absolutely. I personally want to see Ishii take the Intercontinental on the first night and Ibushi take the main belt on the second night, but I don't know if that's too devastating for Naito. We'll see. Gareth, what about yourself? What's one thing that you would book in terms of New Japan on the way to the Dome, or indeed at the Dome?
Yeah, I'm going on your point of Naito being too devastating. I don't think he'll lose both nights, but I think they're going to do the thing where he defends both, so Intercontinental on the first night, just because they mentioned that a couple of times on commentary. And yeah, it kind of makes sense, I guess. So putting that into context, hopefully, I'm just going to assume that they're not going to separate them beforehand, even though I would like to see it happen as well. Mm-hmm. I think it would be interesting to see guys like Sanada and Evil and Kenta kind of take that kind of Ospreay as well, I guess now.
Yeah. Take
that kind of Intercontinental spot for the next couple of years. I think Evil especially kind of needs that to bridge himself into being a top guy and properly find himself. So when you look at that, I guess I'd like to see Sanada take the title, just because obviously they're giving him that big final moment. So I'd like to see that built upon, and then maybe see like an Ospreay just to freshen up, because we have seen Evil and Sanada twice this year. So maybe an Ospreay Sanada thing could be a fresh matchup moving forward from there. And then
that's good.
Ibushi, I'd love him to win, but I'm obsessed with this idea of him kind of not fully turning heel, but just becoming like crazy Ibushi permanently, or a bit more permanently, having a bit of an edge. So if he were to lose and then maybe walk through the New Japan Cup, and then beat Naito further down the line, or maybe someone else has got the heavyweight title by that point. I don't know. That would be nice, I think. So maybe, as much as I love Ibushi and I would love it to see him win, maybe it's a loss that builds him into something better. So there are a couple of things that I'd like to see.
Great. I love that. I agree with you on the Intercontinental. And I would like to go more towards the wrestlers that you just named there, because I always felt in the past it was almost like it was just the main eventers that weren't in the main events. Like, it was Naito versus Tanahashi, Jay White versus Naito, that kind of thing. Yeah. I'd rather see somebody get a kind of big push, like the guys that you mentioned. And I do like your Ibushi theory. It would be kind of cool to see that kind of dark Ibushi. Because I always think that's one of the best things in wrestling when he just switches that on in the middle of a match. So yeah, he could. I can't see them turning him kind of heel, because he's so beloved. But I do love that character. It's really, really fascinating.
Just a bit of an edge on the baby face, I think, would be fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant, cool. Gareth, what do you want to plug? What do you want to push out to people?
We've got
millions
the
and millions.
Rest Hold Wrestling. You can just search that on YouTube, and that'll be our stuff. We do just kind of discussions about things whenever we think there's something to talk about. Mostly New Japan and AEW now. Giving up on WWE. I'm hoping to do some more kind of like, I don't know what you describe it as, but I guess it would be like video essay style videos.
And
but
you have is it an English degree you have, but it's like a specialism in storytelling?
Script writing degree.
Script writing. Okay, so it's like very storytelling based.
Yeah.
So that's quite a good kind of hook for.
That's the angle I come from, with the story. Yeah.
But that's a cool kind of hook if you're kind of there's one or two wrestling podcasts out there. So if you're looking for something different, then go listen to a guy who's got a bit more of a background in how these things are perhaps produced. Dan, what would you like to plug?
I've been writing a few articles for a site called Chops, Kicks and Near Falls. There's a big group of people on there.
Yes.
A lot of them make me feel very old. They're very young and ambitious, but there's a lot of very good writers on there. I've been doing a series about people moving from NXT to the main roster in WWE and how, well, I started it as how many people has it worked for? It's turned out now who's the worst, effectively. Because every time I end up finishing it, like, no, it hasn't.
On a scale of
exactly.
bads to can't wrestle again, how has it gone?
Exactly. So, but also I've just finished an article for a web where I looked at Dave Meltzer's ratings and compared them to the ratings on the Grapple app. To see sort of what the trends were there, which are some interesting results on there. So yeah, go and check that one out.
Yeah, I think people would be very surprised. That was like that kind of ending of the article is like really interesting, and the kind of talk around whether or not we should listen to Dave Meltzer's pretty much. I mean, it's one article and it's one tournament, but like there's 91 matches in that tournament. It's pretty conclusive. I don't think I introduced myself at the start of the podcast. I'm Craig from PWMusings.com. Very amateur podcast host, obviously, can't even give you my name at the beginning. Please check out the website. There's lots of really cool stuff on it. Dan's article, obviously. Jay Michael, who's done stuff for Voices of Wrestling, wrote a fascinating statistical kind of analysis of like all the G1 participants, kind of their booking versus their grapple kind of averages and stuff like that. It's really, really kind of smart stuff. You've got to check out Chester's work on ratings. There's a lot of people that kind of, it's a bit beyond Brian Alvarez's kind of tweet where he just says, I know that he does other stuff on his site, but this is for free. Really, really smart stuff. But yeah, thank you to Dan and Gareth for joining me for this talk about the G1. Give us your feedback wherever, you'll find the comment sections wherever you go. Thank you for joining us. Hope you're having a nice day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.